Last week, we had a very important bill passed through the German parliament, the Bundestag, known as the Selbstbestimmungsgesetz. This was a law created by the current traffic light coalition of the SPD, Greens, and FDP. And what it basically does is it liberalizes Germany's gender identification laws, making it easier for individuals to change their own gender. And what it states is that any individual can do that once a year, and they can go to apply at government offices and they will receive new IDs, passports that will reflect this. And it also implements strict fines for refusal to recognize the legitimacy of this decision, meaning that people who refuse to refer to someone by their new chosen gender can end up having to pay a fine. Now, this law was seen as a victory for the liberals, the progressives that make up the governing coalition, especially the Greens, who have championed themselves as the defender and protector of the LGBTQ community, most of which, especially in the younger demographics, are supporters of the Greens. This party has made, of course, identity issues like this a core part of their platform. And this law had been actually in play for a while. It had been something that had been planned for a few years now, and so it's not a surprise that this has happened. But it is nonetheless a controversial bill. The CDU, the CSU, and the AFD voted against it, and most conservatives, of course, saw the law as completely unnecessary and also an attack on tradition. But in the end, it was able to achieve a majority with the support of the governing coalition. There were a few members of the FDP that defected and actually voted against it, but it ended up passing with a clear majority in the Bundestag. But what I wanted to talk about today is actually the way that this issue has completely divided the left, or what was the left party in Germany. Now, identity issues like this one have been a problem for the party in the past. It was a source of discussion within the party for some time. In fact, it was one of the reasons why Sahra Wagenknecht stated she left the party, because she claimed that gender identity issues, or identity issues in general, like this one, were too much of a focus instead of traditional working class, socialist policies that appeal to their voter base, or at least to the majority, the broad majority of their voter base. Now, something very interesting happened on the debate floor when this law was passed. Before it was passed, actually, each party was given a speaking time. They had a representative speaker from each grouping. And Sarah Wagenknecht gave a speech openly attacking the bill, saying it was not only crazy but dangerous, that it threatened women's rights, allowing men to access spaces that were safe for women, women's safe spaces. And this was a moment of division between the two groups that really flared up. And the BSV politicians were, of course, clapping for Wagenknecht, whereas the other politicians were screaming, yelling at her. And these are all former colleagues. And the president actually had to get involved. There was a point where the newly elected parliamentary leaders of the left party, Heidi Reichneck and Zoran Pellmann, were arguing with some of the BSV politicians right next to them. And keep in mind, these people are all colleagues. They were colleagues, rather, and some of them had actually been working together for decades, even going back into the 90s. And this issue has pretty much driven a wedge in between these two groups. There was tension before, after the split, but now it's clear that they are headed in completely different directions. And it is safe to say that the relationship between the two groups is pretty much non existent at this point. There appears to be that they are staunch enemies of each other. And as we can see, in the upcoming elections, it's not likely that both of these groups will survive. One of them will cease to exist on the political scene. So what we effectively have is a battle in Germany for the left of the political spectrum, and an identity crisis. And it is going to be between, of course, the BSV and the remnants of the old Die Linke, the left party, and when it's going to determine which of those are going to claim the throne of being Germany's left. And it is going to be a very brutal and bloody conflict, politically speaking, of course, over the next couple weeks and months, however long it lasts, and we will see in the end who wins. And what I want to do now is look at some of the upcoming elections in the East German states and at the European Parliament, and look at some of the numbers, the polling numbers for both of these parties, and see what will likely happen as we get closer to the elections, and kind of get a picture of where this fight is headed. All right, I first want to take a look at the way each of the parties voted on the bill itself. And as we can see here up at the top, 372 voted for it, 251 against, 11 abstained, and 100 were not present. The SPD and the Greens unanimously voted for it, with the CDU, CSU, and AFD unanimously voting against it. Now, in the FDP, there was some division. The overwhelming majority of the party supported it. However, there were 9 that voted against and 5 that abstained. This was a significant chunk, but nowhere near enough to prevent the bill from reaching a majority in the Bundestag. And here, down here, we can see the division, as I pointed out in the video, between the two parties. The BSV all voting against it, and the majority of Die Linke supporting it, except 3 that abstained. These two groups for several months have been separate, but before that were actually as one political group, one parliamentary group and party, and we can see the clear division here in the way they voted. Now, if we look at the polling for the federal level and across the states, we can see that the BSV is generally ahead of Die Linke. They're at 6.1%. This is not a large amount of the vote, but this is enough for them to win seats. The threshold to get seats in the German parliament is 5%, so we can see the BSV is clearly ahead of that. Not too much, but enough for them to win representation. Die Linke, however, is at 3.5%. They were polling at around 4.5, 5% until the split happened, and now that that has happened, Die Linke has fallen even further, and it is likely that they will lose representation in the Bundestag, which will significantly hurt them as a political force and their representation on the political scene. Now, not all of the voters from the BSV are coming from Die Linke. Some are from the SPD and the AFD, but there's no doubt that they have definitely hurt them some. And we can see, if you look at it percentage-wise, the BSV is around twice as strong as Die Linke in most of the country. Now, if we look at Brandenburg, which is the most left-wing of the states. This is a state that used to have a very strong left-wing association state party, even when it was under the PDS, before it became Die Linke. Very strong, competing with even the SPD, 2 left-wing parties competing for first place in the state. That has changed a long time ago, and the AFD since 2019 has risen. Also, the CDU has been able to strengthen themselves. So the state is nowhere near as left-wing as it used to be. But nonetheless, we can see the BSV at 10%, a moderate, very respectable result for a new party. Die Linke is at 6%, meaning they will hold on to representation in the parliament, but it is not, inconceivable that they will actually end up falling below this. But we can see the BSV clearly ahead of Die Linke here in this East German state of Brandenburg. Now, Saxony is the opposite of Brandenburg. This is the most right-wing state of the East German states, and of course there's pretty much no chance of a left-wing government coming to power or a government led by a left-wing governor. Nonetheless, we can see that the BSV here is at 11%, asserting themselves as the strongest of the various left-wing parties, and Die Linke itself is fallen below 5%, and them losing representation here is very significant because this is the biggest state in East Germany of around 4.5 million people. They still have the city of Leipzig with very, younger voters that support them heavily. However, this is not going to be enough. They need to get over 5% to win seats, and if they lose representation here and not even in the parliament, then the BSV has clearly been able to insert themselves over Die Linke in this state. Of course, these are only polls, so this could change. Now, the most important of all is the state of Thuringia. Now, Thuringia is very interesting because it has 2 important factors that come into play here that actually make both parties very, very strong. And this is actually the state that is going to be the strongest state for each of the parties, and that is because Die Linke has the current incumbent governor of the state, Bodo Ramelow, is from Die Linke, a very strong personality in the state. And Sahra Wagenknecht herself, although she is not politically represented in the state, she's not an elected official from this state, she was born in this state. She was born in Thuringia. And so both of these parties have a personality connection to the state that significantly strengthens their support here. And we can see in this state, it's actually a different picture. Die Linke is actually ahead of the BSV, but they're basically kind of even at around 15%. Now, this election would be very important. And as we can see here, however, the results are going to be very important for each of the parties involved. Now, it is unlikely that the current left-wing government of Die Linke, SPD, and Greens will retain a majority, or rather win the majority back. They're actually currently a minority government. And even if you include the BSV, it's unlikely that a left-wing alliance of the 4 parties, even if that's viable, would be able to beat the AfD and CDU for a majority of the seats. But nonetheless, we can see this is the strongest result for the BSV at around 14%, putting them in fourth place. Die Linke, although they're beating them, this is a significant drop in support, minus 14%, losing around half their support. So this is technically a victory for Die Linke. Yes, they are beating the BSV in this one state. However, it is with significant losses, and it is only because they have the governor here. They have that personality that they were able to stay ahead. And these elections will happen in September, and once we get the actual result, we will kind of able to see more where this divide between the two parties is going. It's not certain that if Die Linke completely loses representation or the other way the BSV does, that either party will cease to exist, but it is likely that if they lose more and more presence on the political scene, we could see them completely collapse. Nonetheless, I wanted to do a video covering this topic and issue, especially after the vote happened and we had the kind of divide and debate within the parliament. And I will do more videos as these elections approach, and I hope you all like the video, and so please like, share, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.